To make the next speaker co-host, by the way.
Super. Without further ado, it's a huge pleasure to introduce Tim Dalgleish for his keynote address. I've known Tim since the very beginning of my research and clinical career in mental health. I followed his pivotal work on transdiagnostic models of cognition and emotion and the kind of transdiagnostic impact of traumatic stress for all the years since then, and we're talking over 2 decades now. He's currently the director of the Cambridge Clinical Research Centre for Affective Disorders and a senior research scientist at University of Cambridge Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit. And as I'm sure you know, he's also the initiator of this very conference that began in 2018. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Tim's keynote, and I'll pass on to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Warren. I'll just try and share my screen. Oh, it says screen sharing disabled. Is that okay for everybody? So you can hear me all right? Great. Yep. Okay. Thanks so much for the kind invitation to give this talk. Melissa and I may have started these conferences, but obviously we're standing on the shoulders of giants in the transdiagnostic field who really invented the field, and it's so nice to see some of the authors of the original book, which very much framed all of our thinking here today. So it was very tempting when Warren asked me to give a talk to just really update on the data from our Transdiagnostic intervention trial, which Mel did a teaser talk for 3 years ago. But I thought I should try and be a bit braver, so that's what I've tried to do. So please be gentle with me while I work through this. I'm not able to move my slides on. Let me just try and see if I can get that to work. Oh, here we go. And the reason I wanted to focus on what I'm going to talk about is a paper that Mel, myself, and 2 of our colleagues wrote in parallel with the last conference, which really tried to evaluate where we're at in thinking about transdiagnostic approaches to mental health, and I guess the current status and importantly the future directions where we might like to be going. And we ended that paper with 5 challenges for transdiagnostic science, and the first of those concerned the development of relevant theory. So there was a concern that we didn't really have a theory to deliver the translational promise and the integration across fields that we needed. So rather than just throw this out there and just sit back and let the much better theoreticians in the world, such as Warren, deal with it, I thought I would talk a little bit more about that today, and especially the theoretical work that we've been trying to do over the last 3 or 4 years in Cambridge to try and meet this challenge. So of course, we're at the home of one of the transdiagnostic theories, perceptual control theory. So that was really another reason for focusing on this topic. I thought I'm at least going to be amongst people who are interested, even if they don't necessarily agree with my point of view. And also because of the other keynote speakers, I noticed Tim Carey is giving the last keynote ending the conference, where he's going to solve all of these problems in his talk, Beyond Transdiagnosis, Life is Control, No Diagnosis Necessary. So I'm hoping that I can kind of throw down the challenge, and at the end, Tim can pick up the gauntlet, mixing my metaphors there, and solve all the problems. So it's really a story of 2 Tims. I think I'm the one clinging on for dear life, and he's the one sitting there with all the answers. So that's really what I'm going to try and do today. So what I really wanted to do was talk about the sort of journey I've been on, and those of us in Cambridge have been on, trying to think about these things. And that really has involved going back to first principles to think about what would a theory in this space look like? How would we position it? What kind of explanatory frameworks would we want to integrate it and ground it within, and take it through there? Because I think, as I'll say in a few minutes, I think that's something which we don't do so much in psychology. So I think it's good to start by saying, well, what is a theory? And I really recommend Iko Fried, who's also, we're lucky enough to have a keynote from him later in the conference, work in this area. He's really been working a lot in theory development, but also on the sort of social and philosophical aspects of theorizing within psychology. And his blog on theory is an excellent place to start, and it comes with a really good reading list for those who are perhaps less used to thinking in this way. And what he does is he starts with this very helpful definition that theories and models, he makes a distinction between them, but I'm not going to do that today, help us to understand, explain, predict, and control phenomena. And he talks about which of these is most important to you, and that should somehow guide your theory. But of course, in mental health, all of these things are important. This is the business of mental health science, all of the things we're trying to do collectively. So we're trying to understand mental health problems, but we're also trying to predict their onset, their course, and their recovery. And we're trying to control them, for want of a better word, through education, prevention, and intervention. And something that's not in Iko's definition is we also use our theories for communication between academics and clinicians, and critically between clinicians and patients. So the theories have to be digestible to a wide set of stakeholders. So one thing that you realize after a few minutes of trying to think theoretically is theorizing is very, very hard. And unlike other disciplines, we have almost no training in theory. As psychologists, we have very little grounding, most of us, in philosophy of science and what constitutes a theory or a model or a framework, and how we might develop those things, and what other constraints and parameters we might want to apply. So what this means is we tend to absorb by osmosis the theories of those around us when we're starting off in our careers. So I started at the Maudsley, the Institute of Psychiatry, very much grounded in the cognitive behavioural tradition.
That's great that you feel a piece about.
In the CBT, I had someone else talking. In the CBT tradition, and those were really the theoretical views I took forward. And now I'm in a cognitive neuroscience unit, a very different set of theoretical ideas around predictive processing and prediction error models. And again, those have been very influential. So rather than going back to first principles, we tend to absorb the theoretical atmosphere that we grow up in, if you like. The other thing we do, because theory is so hard and we have so little training, is we focus actually on just collecting data and collecting things to explain. And there's this great quote from Cummins saying, we are overwhelmed with things to explain, but somewhat underwhelmed by things to explain them with. And another upshot of this situation is that psychological theories are often verbal. They're often quite underspecified with respect to the vast amounts of data that we now have available as psychologists to explain. And on that basis, they have been criticized as weak, soft, or underspecified, or plagued by post hoc auxiliary assumptions. By this, I mean when data don't fit the theory, we just come up with a whole set of assumptions as to why the theory needs to be slightly modified to account for the new data. And I think this has actually been labeled the theory crisis within psychology, that our theories are possibly a bit of a laughing stock. I don't actually share this view, and I'll slightly go against it a bit later. But this led Miel, quite a while ago now, obviously a pioneering theoretical and philosophical clinical psychologist, to say that, well, most psychological theories never tend to be completely refuted or corroborated. Instead, they just merely fade away as people lose interest. So why do we need new theory? It's not as if we don't have some theories in psychology. As I've just said, we grow up often within a theoretical crucible, which we absorb theoretical ideas from. I was very much influenced by cognitive therapy models. So why do we need a new theory, or what one could even argue is a meta theory? And I think this goes back to the last conference, really, where what struck me was that we had fantastic people talking from 3 different domains of transdiagnostic clinical science. There were the people who are interested in symptom nosology, whether it be the high-top hierarchical symptom model or bifactor models or network models. There's high top there. There was another group of people who are very much the sort of RDoc crowd who are interested in mechanistic models, biopsychosocial processes. And yet there was another group of people who are very clinical, who derive their thinking entirely from within the clinical paradigm and are very much uninfluenced by these, there's the RDoc, very much uninfluenced by these other domains. So there were great talks by people, for example, advocating the unified protocol, which is very much derived from CBT. And so it seemed that one thing that was lacking was a common framework that would allow us to talk to each other. A common theoretical framework, I'm going to argue, that would allow those areas to be integrated. But what also struck me was what each of those areas is doing was trying to go beyond the idea of single diagnoses. So if we take these nosological approaches, what they're trying to do is broaden out the thinking within nosology across from a single diagnosis to a broader diagnostic space. That's why they're at the conference. Whether it be what we might call a weak version of a transdiagnostic approach, which is, well, we're just looking at what's common across different diagnoses, but we're going to keep the diagnostic ideas in there, or a strong approach where we abandon diagnoses altogether and look for a completely new way of thinking about the symptom space. And the same with the biopsychosocial approaches, whether it's Allison and colleagues' book or the RDoc approach, they're really trying to look at how these processes are relevant across diagnoses. And again, the clinical approaches are expanding the brief. So what we find, though, is that another common theme, especially in the nosology and the RDoc domain, is removing the barriers between thinking about mental health problems and mental health and other aspects of so-called normal human functioning. So each of these areas has expanded the brief, not only across the diagnostic space from small numbers or individual mental health problems to a much broader set of issues, but also between a notion of abnormal functioning or mental health problems to a broader dimensional view of a continuum between healthy and mentally unhealthy functioning. And I would argue that theory is really, really lagging behind compared to the work in these other 3 areas. So we don't really have theory that has taken a similarly expansive view, that has expanded beyond small numbers or individual diagnoses, that really tries to integrate with normal functioning, and that really tries to think about how clinical problems emerge from, clinical interventions emerge from that. There are some exceptions, which I'll come to later. And what we don't have, which was really the starting point, is a theory that allows us to link these things, to 3 things together. So I think for all these reasons, we need a new theoretical framework that can do justice to the transdiagnostic ambition that we've got, and also to integrate these different domains of endeavour that we're all working in. So what's our starting point? So one could say, well, maybe we've got some pretty good theories there already, and really it's just a question of trying to step back a bit and expand their focus. Well, actually, I think the pickings are much slimmer than that. So I think actually significant parts of the transdiagnostic space within which those different domains are embedded are actually atheoretical, or even worse, perhaps harbour implicit or unhelpful theories. And this, I think, has its origins in the diagnostic approach that we're all, I think, thinking quite carefully about trying to replace. So we know that the DSM, after the DSM-2, which was obviously very, up to that point, very psychoanalytically and theoretically driven, since then, it's been a purposely atheoretical exercise. Instead, choosing to focus on what you might call behavioural topography. What are the patterns of signs and symptoms that co-occur, and how can we cluster these together in a set of diagnoses? But as Karl Popper famously wrote about, you can't just make theory from observation in this simple way. Theory is always going to be involved in what you observe. So he tells a story of trying to lecture to physics students about his concerns about the inductive method of going from pure observation to theory. So he sat all the physics students down and said, okay, here's your pencil and paper. Now please write down what you observe. And after a few minutes, they said, well, what sort of things should we be looking at? And that was, of course, his exact point. So what the diagnostic approach does is it actually gives us a set of things, a set of signs and symptoms, and says, this is what you should be theorizing about. We're not theoretical, but we've decided what the explicanda, if you like, are for any future theoretical endeavor. So it's never going to be possible for it to be theory neutral. And of course, also, there is a very strong implicit theory within the diagnostic system. It's grounded very much in the medical model. And you only need to read the introduction to the DSM, even the current edition, to see that it's really an idea of aspects of the system that are broken, a difference between mental health and mental ill health that's qualitative, clear distinctions between different disorders. And I think the other problem with the diagnostic approach, which you've also inherited, is that it's got a mishmash of signs and symptoms. So some of them might be affective, some of them are cognitive, some of them are behavioral, some of them are based on etiology, such as in PTSD, some of them are very much grounded in a developmental framework. And it's very unclear what the different relationships between these different categories of signs and symptoms might be. They're just all bundled together as collectives of problems which we can use to characterize a particular disorder. And we've inherited a lot of this in our transdiagnostic thinking. So let's think about that a bit more in terms of our 3 transdiagnostic domains. Just have a drop of water. So if we think about our symptom nosologies, again, I think you can argue that these are profoundly a-theoretical. They're essentially statistical models of how all the symptoms might relate together. If we abandon the a priori ex cathedra diagnostic manuals and think about a data-driven way of thinking about how these symptoms cluster. So this is an example from Hightop. So not only are they not really grounded in theory, we have no idea why these symptoms might cluster together. And that's going to really impede our ability to translate the insights from this approach into what I'm interested in, which is psychological interventions. If we don't really understand anything about mechanisms, about how these things co-occur and how they change over time, how they arise, how they dissipate, then it's going to be very difficult to come up with psychological interventions which target those things. And of course, what is also a problem is that these approaches have inherited the sets of symptoms from the diagnostic model. There's been no attempt to think, is this really the problem space we're trying to explain? It's really just taking those symptoms and thinking about a different. And another approach, the process approach, and I'll use RDoC as an example here, this almost takes the opposite view and says, well, what are all of the processes that are involved in human mental life, essentially? And again, it purports to be a-theoretical, but actually it has an implicit theory inside it. One part of it is that everything's on a dimension. Mental health problems are abnormal extremes along those dimensions. A second part of it is that it's not very well disguised biological approach. It's very much grounded in the brain theories of mental health problems, even though it's supposedly not supposed to have any kind of theoretical doctrine behind it. And a final problem with it, I think, is that it's really not about integration of processes. It's really about fractionation of processes. So I've put an example up there of someone feeling very comfortable in a car. So if we think of mental health problems and mental health, it's a very, very complex system involving interactions between many, many different processes, many of which are articulated in the RDoC. And if we think about a complex system that we know about a bit more than we do about what's the nature of human mental life, say a car, that's a very complex system. And we think about the things we care about in a car. One of them might be how comfortable is the car to drive? And that's the analogy to what we think about in terms of mental health, which is not about any individual process, but it's, how mentally healthy do people feel, or how much are they struggling? So if we wanted to understand, well, what makes a car comfortable to drive, we wouldn't look at its individual constituents. Well, is it the wheel nuts? Is it the carburetor? Is it the is it the size of the engine? We think that the comfort of the car, you know, how well it is to drive at speed, how good it is at cornering, what it's like to sit in, is a combination of a complex interaction of those different different components. Yet some of these process approaches like RDoC really don't seem to embrace that complex system view that seems to be absolutely critical in my mind in trying to understand mental health problems. And I'll talk a bit more about the intervention space later. I think we've got some really good theories within this space, but they do tend to be somewhat narrowly focused on either individual disorders or small sets of disorders. And so I think there's still work to do to expand the ambition of our clinical theories to this much broader transdiagnostic arena that we're talking about. So I think when this is where we got to when we started our wish list. What would we like to see in a transdiagnostic theoretical framework? So we want something that integrates across symptom nosology, underlying mechanistic processes, and clinical preventions and interventions. We want something that integrates across multiple mental health problems, and I'm interested in what I'm calling common mental health problems, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, stressor-related disorders, for want of better terms, to to talk about them. Someone's in the waiting room, so I'm just going to press admit. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but and we want something that deals with this dimensionality, which seems to be a real key feature of how we're all thinking. So it doesn't have to, it mustn't just be a theory that inherits the sort of disease model of the diagnostic system, but in fact preserves the idea of continua between mental health and mental ill health. So this is our initial wish list, and it's quite a daunting challenge, I think. And the final thing, which I think I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, is we want something that is also constrained by broader theories of the mind. So I think some of the problem with our clinical theories is they are just that. They're theories about disorder, and they're not really grounded in theories of order. And I think we need to do that, not just beyond the domain of mental health, but also broader components of human sentience. So we really want a theory of mental health that's grounded in a broader theory of mind. So once I got to this point in thinking, I realized that the next challenge was positioning the thoughts that we might have within a set of levels. So people who work in theory are obsessed with putting things in different levels or hierarchies where you have to position your own thinking in order to make progress. So I'm just going to talk through some of the levels that had to be negotiated in trying to think about what a transdiagnostic theory would be, in order to populate this wish list with a bit more detail and a bit more meat. So the first, really, I'm calling levels of granularity. And so you can imagine a theory grounded in physics, in subatomic physics, quarks, atoms, that's really a theory of everything, a theory of all matter, including life, human life, mental health, and so on. That's not really the level of theory that we're interested in, though I'll come back to that in a minute. You can also imagine biological theories, which are essentially theories of living things, what constitutes a living thing, what do living things have in common. Then more specifically, what it means to be a human being, a theory of human life. And then within that, human sentience, what it is to be a human mind, to have a human mind, what are the implications of that, and then human mental health and so on. So we really need to decide, well, at what level are we going to be pitching our theory? And whatever level it is, it's always going to be, of course, constrained by the levels above it. You're not going to come up with a theory of human mental health, which uses a physics that doesn't, it basically doesn't exist in the rest of the world. So it always has to fit within those higher order levels and be constrained by them. But it doesn't really have to be a theory at those levels. And in philosophy of science, this is called an in situ theory. So we don't need to make our theory of human mental health one that is essentially written in the laws of physics. We can come up with our own language of psychology and language of cognition within which to frame that theory, as long as it doesn't transgress those other views. So within this in situ explanation, we have to decide, well, what's our level of explanation? And we hear a lot, and this is something that's within the RDoc, that these theories have to be biopsychosocial. So what does that really mean? So I'm a clinical psychologist, and my view is I really want a psychological theory of the transdiagnostic mental health space. And what I take biopsychosocial to mean is that we need to understand the social factors as they impinge on our psychological theory. And we need to understand biological factors as they impinge on our psychological theory. So the influence of the social on the psychological, the influence of having a body, of having interoception, of having affect, of having feelings on the psychological. I don't take biopsychosocial to mean a theory that simultaneously gives you a theoretical framework at the social, biological, and psychological levels. I agree that some people aspire to that, but that's not really what I would be wanting to do. And the final level on this first set of levels, there's more to come, believe it or not, is time. So how do we want to think about our theory in terms of time? So obviously, clinically, we do this a lot. We think initially cross-sectionally about someone who we see in the clinic, about what how their mental health problems might interact and what the vicious circles of relationship between feelings and processes and behaviors might be. And we think about what the implications might be for the future. And then we might do a broader longitudinal formulation across the lifetime. Well, how do these patterns emerge? And where do they come from? But I would argue that we need to be even more ambitious than this. And the way I'd like to think about human mental health problems within the common mental health problem space is that they're so common, they're so prevalent, and they're so disabling in many cases that we really need to think about them in an evolutionary framework. We need to think, why would these things have evolved, and what was their function back when what I guess evolutionists would call the last kind of hunter-gatherer period, when human evolution really involved profound changes. So what was it about what we now look to see as mental health problems? What was it about those psychological states that conferred a fitness advantage back then when things were adaptive, before we entered the very, very small and ongoing part of human history where, you know, imminent threats to survival were not a moment-by-moment concern. So we've started to add more to our wish list. I think I'm saying we want a theory that's about human mental health and domains of mental health, but that is also constrained by understanding broader theories of human sentience and of human life. We want it to be a psychological theory that pays respect to the biological and social contexts within which human minds operate. And we want it to be a theory that's grounded in the lifetime of the individual, but is again very much constrained by our understanding of evolution and why minds have evolved to be like they are in the first place. So we've now populated our wish list a little bit more. We've got a psychological lifespan theory of human mental health. It's an evolutionary grounded theory. And what we've said before, it's integrated with broader theorizing on human sentience and the biosocial, and integrates across our different domains and our different mental health problems. But there's yet more levels that we need to think about if we're an aspiring theoretician. And that really is the kind of language, the explanatory currency within which we're going to frame our theory. Now, most theories in psychology, either explicitly or implicitly, operate within an intentional stance. And by this, I mean they're couched in language of beliefs, desires, and intentions. We might not call them that. They might be called goals or plans or or whatever, but essentially they utilize a language of beliefs, desires, and intentions. But I don't think that's really enough for the mental health space we're trying to operate in. And one criticism of the intentional stance approach pioneered by Daniel Dennett in its pioneering book is that it really ignores other things that the patients we work with, and I think therefore we as theoreticians need to care about, is what it feels like to be to have a human mind, to be a person. So that's consciousness, emotions, and the nature of inner experience. So I've expanded the kind of brief of the BDI, not to be confused with the Beck Depression Inventory, to this idea of the BDIP, the beliefs, desires, intentions, and phenomenology. And this way of thinking comes across many theoretical frameworks within philosophy of science and psychology. So I've got Dennett's ideas of the intentional stance here, which is where I'm positioning the sorts of language we tend to theorize in within. But there's another level below that called the design stance, or we like it in Cambridge, David Miles used, because he was from Cambridge and was working at the CBU where I'm from for a while, what he called the algorithmic level. So how are these beliefs, desires, and intentions actually actually computationally realized within a system? And then the final level at the top is really about how they're implemented. In this case, how might they be implemented in the brain? And actually, as psychologists, we really extend our theories to incorporate this second level below that of beliefs, desires, and intentions. We're also interested in what are the computations and the representations that these beliefs, desires, and intentions play out in. And whether it be cognitive therapy theories or cognitive theories in cognitive psychology, or any of the other theories we're going to talk about later, we tend to try and think about, well, what are the representations we're working with, and what computations are performed on those representations in order to generate different profiles of mental experience that we care about. So I think the language that we're interested in working with is really a belief, desire, intentional phenomenology, where we try as much as possible to realize what the computations and representations which deliver that computational level of thinking might be. Now, the unit I work in cares a lot also about the third level, the implementation. How might these theories be realized in the brain? I personally care much less about that. And I think it's because it's really up for grabs whether the kinds of things we care about as psychologists, belief, desires, intention, goals, plans, attention, memory, whether they really are going to be deliverable in terms of an implementation into brain states, or whether we're going to have to abandon them completely. And so I'm much more interested in developing theory at a psychological level using this explanatory fabric, and much less concerned about whether it can be implemented. But what I would do is say that that concern should be something that you use to decide between theories when in all other respects they seem like equally good options. The future proofing of a theory in that it might have more traction to be implementable in the hardware of humanity is something that you could use to constrain your choice. And this isn't a new insight. This is something that Leibniz famously articulated. It's been called the Leibniz gap, the big gap between these first two levels and the level of implementation when it comes to the human mind. So we've got a bit more on our wish list now: a psychological theory of mental health, evolutionary grounded, and so on. And now I'm saying that, for me anyway, it needs to be framed within the belief, desire, intention, phenomenology paradigm. And with a commitment to instantiating it within a computational, representational understanding as much as we can. So just one more little excursion into levels, which is within this computational representational level, where we're trying to instantiate our theories, the language we're trying to use about what are the representations and what are the computations that are performed on them, we can have varying degrees of specificity. So you can imagine an entirely verbal depiction, and we use these all the time within the transdiagnostic space, for example, clinically. So a vicious circle would be an example. So we have a set of beliefs about something, for example, that increased distress is due to some biological process, like in panic disorder. I'll use this as an example in a minute. So it's a sign that we're dying, or that we're ill, or about to have a heart attack. So there's a belief there. And the more we interpret those physiological symptoms in line with that belief, the more arousal is generated, which of course increases those symptoms. So you can imagine there we've got different representations, we've got beliefs, we've got a concept of arousal, and we've got relationships between the two of them that compute to create this vicious circle. We don't really need to go beyond that verbal description to find that an extremely useful theory, as I'll say in a minute. But actually, there's now a massive debate within psychology, and I think this is a reaction to the theory crisis, the criticism that a lot of psychological theories are weak or underspecified, that we should be formalizing our theories way beyond this verbal level of description. So we should be coming up with mathematically realized theories or computationally realized theories that go beyond just a simple descriptive analysis of the space. And I suppose at the moment I would argue somewhat against that. So if we look at some of the papers that are coming out, there's some great work by Denny Borsboom within the network theory space on going how we go from our data to these more formal, mathematically realized network theories. And there's now, ECO's been involved in this great paper on using formal theory as a toolkit for theory construction. And then there's reactions to this saying, well, this kind of real drive for formal modeling is not going to solve the crisis that we're in. So just to illustrate briefly, here's one example which I already touched on. There's now a really impressive computational formalized mathematical theory of panic disorder. And it takes the verbal theory that I just articulated, David Clarke's theory from the mid-80s. So the vicious circle that I've just rather clumsily talked through between arousal and perceived threat, and the beliefs that underlie that relationship, and says, well, this really underspecifies the space. So there could, if we look to the right, there's all sorts of mathematical relationships between arousal and perceived threat. There's all sorts of ways that threat and arousal can increase. They could increase linearly, they could increase non-linearly. Their relationship might be linear or non-linear. And how we formally model those relationships is going to have profound differences on the way people experience not only the changes in their arousal in the face of threat, but also natural variations in arousal over time. So I think this sort of work is incredibly valuable. It really does constrain our hypotheses, and I think it does force us to be tighter in terms of our theory. But actually, if we go back to David Clarke's original model, his approach very much came from clinical work. And I actually have some insight into this because I was an undergraduate in Oxford when he was writing from 84 to 87, and he was my tutor. So I had weekly meetings with him, and he would use the time to just talk through these ideas on panic disorder that he was writing at the time. We rarely talked about my essays. And his view really was, well, what I want is a generic framework for understanding the relationship between these factors. But I acknowledge that for any individual patient in the clinic, the exact relationship between these factors is going to differ. For some people, the relationship might be somewhat exponential. For some, it might only kick in at high levels of arousal. The nature of the beliefs is going to differ from one person to another. But that's how I'm going to deal with that through individual formulation. So what I want is a general verbal description couched within belief, desires, and intentions, computationally realized by having computations on representations, but not really something where he felt there was a need to go to these very formalized views. So I think what I would say about this formalized approach is it's really useful if we can be sure we can generalize it to everybody we're going to see in the clinic. Otherwise, I think the jury for me is still out. So adding to our list then, we've got the idea that we want the potential for formalization. So again, I think we should choose our theory as one that can potentially be modeled mathematically or computationally where it's helpful, but I don't think that's where we have to be. It didn't really do Darwin any harm. There's not many mathematical formulations of the theory of natural selection. I'm not saying there aren't now in evolution, but I think when we're broadening out to the transdiagnostic space, we don't need to go straight for formalization. And I think it's a bit of a reaction to the theoretical crisis in the discipline more generally. So we've got our wish list. What's the shop window look like for options where we might couch our new way of thinking? So I've already said I come very much from a CBT background, and there's been some great work now expanding the CBT model away from individual disorders to give a transdiagnostic framework for thinking about all problems together within the CBT set of constraints. So I think this would be a really good place to start. My concern with it is it's not so great at bridging the gap between mental health problems and mental health, and it's not really grounded, obviously, though it can be translated into a general theory of human sentience. And also, I think it's still quite disorder based. So rather than talk about emotions and moods and affect, the constructs are still things like depression or anxiety. So there's still clusters of problems very much inherited from the disorder space. But I think that's a really good place to start in terms of a transdiagnostic theory that ticks all of the things on my wish list. There's obviously network approaches, and I think we're going to hear from ECO later in the conference about why these are useful. I think that for me, they started out as not very helpful because they only focused on symptoms. So my concern there was, well, I'm interested in psychology and mechanisms. Now they've really been expanded to incorporate mechanisms. So now I think of them really as a computational realization of the belief, desire, intention, ideas that we want to work with. They're really looking at how do those different things associate and what are the computations that we might perform between them. So, but I think they're less grounded in questions about, well, why do these mechanisms cluster together? Why do these behaviors and feelings cluster together in the way that they do? So I think they're still more about describing the associations and the computations rather than trying to answer questions which are longitudinally formulated across the individual's life and more broadly within an evolutionary model. There's, of course, the perceptual control theory, which of course has no faults at all. We could just move on from that briefly. I guess one thing I'm slightly concerned about with it is it's far less concerned with phenomenology. It's less about what people feel, what those experiences are, and the critical role that feeling states play and where they come from and how they're grounded in evolution. But I'm sure I'm going to be corrected on that over the next 2 days. And there's the other approach, which is one I prefer, which I work in, and I think it's, again, despite my best efforts, a function of now working in a cognitive neuroscience unit, is the predictive processing approach. And I appreciate that perceptual control theorists feel that predictive processing has just stolen all their ideas, but I don't want to get into that now. So a great book, if you've never read it, by Andy Clark, gives an incredibly helpful introduction to this approach. So we have to choose an explanatory currency. You could invent your own, a new one, but there's some really good options out there. And I personally like an approach that allows me to do all of the things I want to do within the transdiagnostic space, but also does genuinely aspire to come up with a theory that can be instantiated in the brain. And in fact, if you think of Carl Fristen's work more generally, it's also a theory not just of the human mind, but of all life and indeed of all matter, his free energy principle. So you either think he's a genius or you think he's completely crazy, but at least it's got aspirations in those directions. And I actually like the fact that it's, for me, incredibly future-proofed in that way. So I'm not going to have too much time to talk about how I've taken these starting points to develop my own thinking, but the last 2, 3, 4, possibly longer years have been coming up with this preemptive uncertainty model of adaptive and maladaptive mood states, which really takes the predictive processing approach as the explanatory currency to present a verbal account within the belief, desire, intention, phenomenology, computational and representational space that I've talked about. So I'm not going to be able to go through the details, but really it's a theory grounded in affective experiences and tries to understand why we have affect, what it evolved for, and why it's now problematic in terms of the mental health problems that we encounter within the space that we're operating in. And it's actually a framework organized not around emotions, but around human mood states. And the reason for this is that working clinically, I find these are the things that people find most difficult to deal with. So when a patient will come in, they don't really talk about a myriad of emotions they have in the day. They talk about these continually chronic, persistent, difficult mood states that they can't get out of, whether it be an anxious mood or a depressed mood or just feeling angry all of the time. And it seems to be these mood states that that are at the core of the clinical problems that I'm seeing day to day. So the framework is very much influenced by those. And I think an idea I took from some of Nico's work about how to think about these mood states, which he might talk about later, is this kind of homeostatic systems around which other symptoms get organized. It's a theory that's grounded in evolutionary psychology, particularly dual inheritance framework. So the idea that we don't just think about biological evolution, but cultural evolution. And then I won't say too much more about some of the other components here. So the last point is that what it allows us to do, allows me and my group to do, is integrate nosology, process, and intervention. So if we just think about nosology, it's really saying, well, mood states are at the center of the common mental health problem space we're interested in. So we can think about how different mood states can be comorbid or co-occurring, and how problems that center on those mood states might emerge and be mental health problems. And so we can take the mood states as a theoretical starting point and say, well, what are all the problems that coalesce around these homeostatic central hubs, if you like? And that will give us a very, very different symptom space that overlaps with the one that we've inherited from the DSM, but critically has all sorts of other components in it as well. It gives us a similar way to think about process, and it also allows us to develop interventions. And as you know, we've been working on a transdiagnostic modular intervention led by Mel, Shaping Healthy Minds, which is very much grounded in this way of thinking. And just to honor the promise we made at the last meeting, we've just finished our feasibility trial of Shaping Healthy Minds, where our ambition was to compare it to IAP services in secondary care in order to see if it delivered non-inferior or even ideally superior outcomes on a range of common mental health measures. So we're up against about 17 protocols in IAPT and secondary mental care with our single protocol. And you can see across measures of depression, anxiety, numbers of diagnoses, Shaping Healthy Minds was delivering quicker benefits and moderate effect size benefits, even at follow-up, compared to this multiplicity of other protocols. So I feel I've done what I've promised and shown the outcomes of our trial, even though it wasn't the focus of our talk. So I'm going to wind up now. So what I've tried to do is take the challenge that was the first on our list in our review that came out of the last meeting and come up with a wish list of what our transdiagnostic theory would really want to be addressing. What boxes do we need to be ticking? I've then tried to go back to first principles and not just inherit the theories that I grew up with. Ironically, I've ended up in more or less the space I would have done if I'd gone straight there, but at least think about, well, how do we want to position that theory within a broader set of constraints from philosophy of science, whilst also thinking really carefully about our stakeholders. So we need a theory that we can use to have dialogues between nosologists, between clinicians, between researchers, whether they be neuroimagers or trialists. We need a theory that clinicians can work with and understand, and a theory that our patients can work with and understand. So a lot of constraints from our stakeholders have to be met. I've tried to come up with an idea that's future-proof, so it's potentially instantiable within the hardware of humanity, the brain. And I've picked a predictive processing framework to do that, which I realize is not popular within the current constituency. And I've talked a little bit about our intervention and our preliminary results that go side by side with this. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm now happy to hand back over to Warren. Thank you.
Everyone unmute yourself and put your hands together for Tim. So we can hear the claps and see them. Okay. Super. That, I think, with you starting off the conference, Tim, it was a perfect choice to have such an overview of all the different spectrum of transdiagnostic approaches, and then come to that conclusion with some data for us as well that shows a transdiagnostic approach up there competing with the diagnostic ones in our services. It's fabulous. You've probably got a minute for a question you've given yourself.
Sorry about
that. That's fine. I've noted that Moritz wrote in the chat, so I don't know if Moritz, you want to unmute yourself and say something. Otherwise, if anyone wants to put their hand up for a question, that'd be great. And then we'll go for a break. Anybody? Sometimes keynotes are so all-encompassing, it's quite phasing to come up with a question with that level of scope, which is...
I'm just trying to read Moritz's question, but it's quite long.
Yeah, you could, take
it. So as clinical scientists, aren't we obliged to focus on essentially data to build the fundamentals in our discipline? And if not, where do you see purpose for an early career scientist in applied psychotherapy research and clinical science? I think I tried to illustrate with the anecdote about Popper that I think the idea that you can be inductive from just observation alone to theory is actually not true, because the data you choose to collect has to be determined somehow by a theory that you've got. And if you don't know that, then it's because your theory is implicit, and that's doing far more damage than a theory that you're explicitly aware of. So I would encourage any early career researcher to think about what their theoretical framework is at the level that I've articulated. And what they can do is use that as an organizing principle for thinking about new ideas, because otherwise a new idea comes along, you read a paper, you've got nothing within which to situate it. So how do you evaluate it? You can see if it's internally incoherent, but if it seems like a very sensible idea, you need really need a framework to understand, do I buy this? Does it fit with my worldview? Does it fit with what I'm trying to do? So you'll end up rejecting that framework many, many times as you go through your career. But I think it's really, really useful to have it right from the beginning if you can. And then use that as a way to approach everything you read, everything you think about, every discussion you have.
Thank you, Tim. That's super. That's a wonderful way to answer the very focused question there. That's very pertinent. We're going to go to a break now, and I urge you all to use your break because the talks coming afterwards are going to be our rapid talks. So we're going to want focused attention throughout while I make everyone co-host ready for 4:10. So I'll see you all shortly, and I'll stop this.